Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 8, Multi-System Interaction. You are not inside one system. You were taught to think in single systems. One environment, one structure, one set of rules. You act, you decide, you respond. It feels linear, clean, contained. But that model is wrong. You are never inside one system. You are inside multiple systems at the same time. They overlap, they interfere, they compete, and most of them you do not see. This is the first distortion. Not lack of intelligence, but misframed perception. Because when you believe you are in one system, you interpret everything through one logic, one rule set, one cause and effect chain. And that creates a false sense of control. You think, if I understand this system, I can predict outcomes. But outcomes are not produced by a single system. They are produced by interaction between systems. And interaction is where distortion begins. Take a simple moment. You speak. You think you are operating in a social system. Language, tone, expression. But at the same time, you are inside a psychological system. Internal states, biases, emotional residue. At the same time, you are inside a power system. Status, perception, positioning. At the same time, you are inside an algorithmic system. Visibility, distribution, interpretation by unseen structures. You are not acting once. You are acting across layers. And each layer interprets your action differently. This is where control fractures, because alignment is rare. What benefits one system can weaken another. What stabilizes one layer can destabilize another. And most people never notice. They optimize for one system and lose in another. They think they are improving, but they are shifting imbalance. This is the second distortion. Success inside a single system is often failure across systems. You perform well socially, but damage long-term positioning. You optimize for attention, but lose structural leverage. You maintain psychological comfort, but sacrifice strategic advantage. And because you only see one system, you misread the outcome. You think, this worked, but it only worked within one layer. The others moved against you. This is why outcomes feel unpredictable. Not because reality is random, but because perception is incomplete. Multiple systems producing one result, but you only track one variable. So the result feels irrational. It isn't. It is multi-layered. This is the third distortion. Misattribution. You assign cause to the system you understand, ignoring the ones you don't. You think a decision failed because of execution, but it failed because another system overrode it. You think a pattern is stable until another system disrupts it. You think control exists until it shifts. And when it shifts, it feels sudden. It isn't sudden. It was always there. You just weren't looking at it. This is where perception must break. Because as long as you think in single systems, you will always be reacting. Late, misaligned, incomplete. To operate differently, you must see layers. Not one system, but many. Not one logic, but competing logics. Not one structure, but overlapping structures. Each with its own rules, its own incentives, its own pathways, and most importantly, its own direction. Because systems don't just exist. They move, they evolve, they expand, they collapse, and they do it independently. Sometimes aligned, sometimes in conflict, sometimes invisible to each other, but never static. This creates dynamic tension, where your position is constantly being reshaped, not by what you do, but by how systems interact around you. At this point, control changes definition. It is no longer making the right decision. It becomes understanding which system is active. Because different systems reward different behaviors, punish different actions, amplify different signals. If you act correctly in the wrong system, you still lose. If you act imperfectly in the right system, you can still win. This is the shift, from action to context, from decision to positioning, from reaction to awareness. And once you see this, you can no longer think simply, because simplicity was never real. It was a reduction, a useful one, but limited. Now the field expands, and with it, complexity increases. But so does clarity. Because now, you are not asking, "What should I do?" You are asking, "Which system is shaping this moment?" And that question changes everything. The illusion of choice. Choice feels personal. It feels internal, intentional, controlled. You evaluate, you decide, you act, and the sequence appears complete. But what you call choice is rarely isolated. It is shaped, filtered, positioned before you ever recognize it. Because you are not choosing from a neutral field. You are choosing inside overlapping systems, each one narrowing your options, each one structuring what is visible and what is not. This is where illusion begins, not because choice is fake, but because it is framed. You don't see everything. You see what systems allow you to see, and visibility defines selection. Take information. You believe you are selecting what to consume, what to read, what to watch, what to believe. But the information you encounter is already filtered, ranked, positioned, not randomly, but structurally. Algorithmic systems determine exposure. They amplify certain signals and suppress others. You scroll, you select, you feel autonomous. But the field has already been arranged. This is the first layer of illusion, not removing choice, but shaping the menu. And once the menu is shaped, the outcome is influenced, even if the act feels free. The same applies to social systems. You believe you are choosing how to act, what to say, how to present yourself. But social structures define boundaries. What is acceptable, what is rewarded, what is rejected. You adjust, often without noticing. Your tone shifts, your language adapts, your behavior aligns, not consciously, but structurally, because deviation has consequences. And systems teach through reinforcement, approval, rejection, visibility, isolation. So your choices begin to converge toward what is accepted. This is not control through force. It is control through alignment, the second layer of illusion. Then come psychological systems, internal, subtle, often invisible. You think your preferences are yours, your desires, your reactions, but they are shaped by accumulated patterns, past experience, conditioning, memory, bias. You choose based on what feels right. But what feels right is constructed. It is not neutral. It is influenced by prior structure. This is the third layer, internal framing, where the system is no longer external, but embedded. And because it feels like you, it is rarely questioned. Now these layers do not operate separately. They overlap, interact, reinforce. An algorithm shows you content. A social system defines its value. A psychological system determines your response. And you call the final result your choice. But it is a convergence. Multiple systems producing a single outcome. And because you only see the final step, you attribute it to yourself. This is misperception. Not error, but incomplete mapping. You see the decision, but not the structure behind it. And because of that, you believe you are in control. This is the most stable form of influence, not removing agency, but guiding it, not forcing outcomes, but shaping probability. Because if systems can influence what you see, how you interpret, and what feels correct, they do not need to control your decision. You will make the decision. They already aligned. This is why control appears invisible, because nothing is imposed. Everything is selected, and selection feels like freedom. But once you see this, choice changes. It does not disappear. It becomes clearer, more precise, because now you begin to ask different questions. Not, what do I want? But, why does this option exist? Not, what should I choose? But, who shaped these options? Not, what feels right? But, what made this feel right? This is where illusion weakens, because systems rely on unexamined flow, automatic alignment, unquestioned structure. The moment you pause and observe, you begin to separate layers. You see the algorithm before the content. You see the social pressure before the reaction. You see the internal bias before the preference. And once layers are visible, influence loses precision. It does not vanish, but it becomes detectable. And what is detectable can be navigated. This is the shift. From being guided to observing guidance. From acting inside systems to recognizing their presence. And once recognition stabilizes, choice becomes something else. Not reaction, not impulse, not alignment, but positioning. Because now, you are not choosing blindly. You are choosing with awareness of structure. And that is the beginning of real control. Hidden pressure from system conflict. Most pressure you feel does not come from one system. It comes from conflict between systems. Not visible conflict, not direct opposition, but structural tension where different systems demand incompatible responses. And you are positioned at the intersection. This is where pressure forms, not from force, but from contradiction. Because each system carries its own logic, its own incentives, its own direction. And when those directions diverge, alignment becomes impossible. You cannot satisfy all systems at once. Something always gives. But most people don't recognize this. They interpret pressure as personal failure, lack of discipline, poor decision-making, weakness. But the real cause is structural misalignment. You are trying to operate as if one system defines the moment. But multiple systems are active, and they are pulling in different directions. Take a common situation. You are presented with an opportunity. One system signals expansion, growth, visibility, potential gain. Another system signals risk, instability, uncertainty, potential loss. A third system introduces social pressure, expectation, perception, judgment. And a fourth, internal, fear, desire, memory. All of them are active at the same time, each one generating signals, each one pushing toward a different action. Move forward, hold back, adjust, wait, commit, withdraw. There is no single correct response because there is no single system. This creates friction, not external, but internalized. You feel it as hesitation, indecision, overthinking. But it is not confusion. It is conflict. Multiple systems competing for execution. And because you are not mapping them, you collapse them into one experience. You call it, I don't know what to do. But what is really happening is that several correct actions exist within different systems, and they cannot all be executed simultaneously. This is the first layer of pressure, competing validity, where each system is correct within its own logic, but incompatible with the others. The second layer is signal interference. When multiple systems overlap, their signals distort each other. Clarity decreases. Messages blur. Priority becomes unclear. You receive conflicting feedback. One system rewards an action. Another penalizes it. One pathway amplifies a signal. Another suppresses it. This creates instability in interpretation. You begin to doubt signals, question direction, hesitate in execution. Not because you lack information, but because information is contradictory. This is not noise. It is structured interference, and it reduces decisiveness. The third layer is delayed consequence. Different systems operate on different timelines. One system rewards immediately, another responds later. A decision may produce a positive outcome in the short term and a negative one in the long term, or the opposite. This creates temporal conflict. You cannot evaluate outcomes in a single frame, because each system responds on its own schedule. And when you misread timing, you misinterpret results. You think something worked when it only worked temporarily, or you think something failed before its effect appears. This creates strategic error, because you optimize for the wrong time frame. The fourth layer is identity fragmentation. When systems conflict repeatedly, your internal model begins to split. You act differently, in different contexts, not strategically but reactively. You align with one system, then switch to another, without integration. This creates inconsistency. You appear unstable, not because you are, but because you are shifting between incompatible systems. And without awareness, this feels like loss of control. The fifth layer is hidden exhaustion. Constant system conflict consumes energy, not physical energy, but cognitive. Decision fatigue increases, clarity decreases, reaction time slows, because every decision requires reconciliation between systems. Even small choices carry layered evaluation. This drains capacity, and eventually you simplify. You choose one system and ignore the others, not because it is correct, but because it is easier. This is where people lock themselves into limited frameworks, not by design, but by relief. They reduce complexity to reduce pressure. But in doing so, they lose accuracy. This is the final distortion. Simplification as escape, not as strategy. But once you see conflict differently, pressure changes meaning. It is no longer a signal of weakness. It becomes a signal of overlap, an indicator that multiple systems are active, and that the situation cannot be resolved through single system thinking. This is where perception sharpens, because instead of asking, "What should I do?" you begin to ask, "Which systems are in conflict?" And that question reveals structure. It separates signals, clarifies direction, exposes hidden forces. And once systems are identified, pressure becomes readable. Not something to eliminate, but something to interpret. Because pressure is not the problem. Unseen structure is. And once structure becomes visible, you are no longer inside the conflict. You are observing it. And that is where control begins. System switching. The illusion of consistency. You believe you are consistent. Your decisions feel aligned. Your behavior feels continuous. Your identity feels stable. But what you call consistency is often switching. Not random switching, structured switching between systems. And because the transitions are smooth, you don't notice them. This is the illusion. You are not acting as one coherent system. You are moving between multiple systems, each with its own rules, its own incentives, its own expectations. And each time you enter a different system, you adjust. Your tone shifts, your priorities change, your responses adapt. But the shift feels natural, so you interpret it as consistency. This is the first layer, invisible transition, where change is masked as continuity. Consider a simple pattern. In one context, you prioritize long-term outcomes, strategic thinking, delayed reward. You operate with patience. In another context, you prioritize immediate response, speed, visibility, quick feedback. You operate with urgency. These are not small variations. They are different systems, each requiring a different mode of operation. But because you transition without awareness, you believe both behaviors belong to the same identity. They don't. They belong to different structures, and you are switching between them. This is not a problem until systems conflict. Because switching works only when systems are compatible. When their rules align, transition feels seamless. But when they diverge, switching creates contradiction. You act one way in one system and a different way in another, without integration, without coordination. This creates fragmentation, not in behavior, but in structure. You begin to experience misalignment, not because you are inconsistent, but because you are switching between incompatible systems without awareness. This is the second layer, unconscious switching, where behavior adapts, but structure does not integrate. This creates confusion. You question your decisions, your patterns, your direction. But the issue is not indecision. It is system transition, without recognition. Now consider something deeper. Each system defines success differently. In one system, success is visibility. In another, it is control. In another, it is stability. In another, it is expansion. If you switch between these systems, without mapping them, you will pursue conflicting outcomes. You will optimize for visibility, then shift toward control, then prioritize stability, then pursue expansion. Each move valid within its own system, but contradictory across systems. This creates oscillation. You move forward, then reverse. You commit, then withdraw. You accelerate, then stabilize. Not because you are unstable, but because you are switching targets. And each target belongs to a different system. This is the third layer, conflicting optimization, where effort is real, but direction is fragmented. Now add another dimension, perception. Each system interprets your behavior differently. An action that signals strength in one system may signal risk in another. A move that creates advantage in one layer may create vulnerability in another. So when you switch, you carry actions from one system into another. And those actions do not translate cleanly. They distort. They misfire. They produce unexpected outcomes. This is why people feel, I did everything right, but it didn't work. Because it worked in the wrong system. This is the fourth layer, context misalignment, where execution is correct, but environment is different. Now here is where it becomes critical. Most people try to fix this by forcing consistency. They attempt to act the same across all situations. Same mindset, same behavior, same strategy. They believe this creates strength. It doesn't. It creates rigidity. Because systems are not uniform, they require different responses, different timing, different positioning. True consistency is not behaving the same everywhere. It is understanding when to switch and why. This is the shift, from unconscious switching to strategic switching, where you do not drift between systems, you move intentionally. You recognize, this is a different system. This requires a different logic. This demands a different position. And you adjust with awareness. Not automatically, not reactively, but deliberately. At this point, identity changes. It is no longer fixed behavior. It becomes adaptive structure. Not unstable, but flexible. Not inconsistent, but multi-layered. You are no longer asking, am I being consistent? You are asking, am I aligned with the system I am in? And that question eliminates confusion. Because now, switching is not a mistake. It is a function, a capability, a form of control. You move between systems without losing direction, because direction is no longer tied to a single structure. It is tied to awareness of structure. And once that stabilizes, you stop trying to act the same everywhere. You start acting correctly within each system. And that is where coherence returns. Not from uniformity, but from precision. System dominance. Which system actually wins? When multiple systems are active, they do not share control. They compete. Not visibly, not directly, but structurally. Each system attempts to define the outcome, not by force, but by influence over interpretation. Because the system that defines interpretation defines reality. This is dominance. Not the strongest system, not the loudest, but the one that determines how signals are read. And once interpretation is set, outcomes follow. This is the first shift. Control is not about action, it is about framing. Which system defines meaning, decides what matters, and what matters drives decisions. Most people misunderstand this. They think dominance means more power, more resources, more visibility. But dominance operates differently. A weaker system can override a stronger one if it controls interpretation. Because behavior does not follow reality. It follows perceived reality. And perception is structured. Now consider a situation. Multiple systems are active. A social system defines approval. An economic system defines value. A psychological system defines comfort. An informational system defines narrative. All of them influence the same moment. But they do not agree. One encourages action, another discourages it. One amplifies opportunity, another highlights risk. One rewards visibility, another punishes exposure. All signals exist at the same time, but only one will dominate interpretation, and that system determines the decision. This is the second shift. Outcomes are not determined by all systems equally. They are determined by the dominant system in that moment. The rest become background noise, still active, still influencing, but secondary. This is why two people in the same situation can act completely differently. They are not in different realities. They are operating under different dominant systems. One prioritizes risk, another prioritizes growth. One responds to social pressure, another ignores it. Same environment, different interpretation, different outcome, because dominance shifts perception. Now here is where it becomes precise. Dominance is not fixed, it is dynamic. Systems rise and fall in influence, depending on conditions. A system that dominates in one context may disappear in another. A system that is weak can become dominant when conditions align. This creates fluid control. Nothing is permanently in charge. Everything depends on alignment between system and context. This is the third shift. Power is conditional, not absolute. And because of that, dominance can be read, not guessed, read. By observing which signals are amplified, which signals are ignored, which behaviors are rewarded, which behaviors are suppressed. This reveals which system is active, not theoretically, but practically. And once you identify dominance, you understand direction, because the dominant system sets the trajectory. Now consider something deeper. Systems do not only compete, they override. One system can suppress another, not by removing it, but by reframing it. A risk becomes opportunity. A loss becomes learning. A failure becomes signal. The underlying reality does not change, but interpretation does. And interpretation defines response. This is how dominance operates, without visibility. It does not eliminate alternatives, it makes them irrelevant. This is the fourth shift. Control is not removing options, it is redefining which options matter. And once that is set, behavior aligns automatically. No force required, no enforcement needed. Now here is where most people fail. They try to control outcomes without identifying the dominant system. They act, adjust, optimize, but within the wrong frame. So even correct actions produce incorrect results, because the system they are optimizing for is not the one in control. This creates frustration, confusion, repeated failure, not due to lack of ability, but due to misaligned system awareness. This is the fifth shift. Before action comes identification. Before strategy comes recognition. Which system is dominant right now? Not in theory, not in abstraction, but in this exact moment. Because once you see it, everything simplifies. Not because complexity disappears, but because direction becomes clear. You no longer attempt to satisfy all systems. You align with the one that matters. Or you position to shift dominance. And that is the next level. Because recognizing dominance is awareness. Shifting dominance is control. And very few operate there. Because it requires not reacting to systems, but interacting between them. Positioning signals, redirecting interpretation, altering which system defines the moment. This is where power exists, not in action, not in force, but in structure. And once you understand this, you stop asking, "What should I do?" You start asking, "Which system is defining this outcome?" And once that answer is clear, everything else follows. System masking, how one system hides another. Not all systems compete openly. Some dominate by staying visible. Others dominate by staying hidden. This is masking, a condition where one system occupies perception while another system controls outcome. You see one layer, you respond to it, but the real structure operates elsewhere. This is where control becomes invisible, because you are not reacting to the system that matters. You are reacting to the system that is shown. This is the first distortion. Visibility is not dominance. What is most visible is often not what is most influential. Consider a familiar pattern. An event appears social, conversation, interaction, surface dynamics. You interpret behavior through social logic, approval, tone, reputation. But beneath that, another system is active. A power system, positioning, leverage, control over direction. The visible layer guides your attention. The hidden layer defines the outcome. You respond to what you see. You adjust tone. You adapt behavior. But the real shift happens in positioning. And because you are not observing that layer, you misread the result. This is masking in action. The second distortion is misdirected optimization. You optimize for the visible system because that is what you perceive. You improve communication. You refine behavior. You align with expectations. But the hidden system does not respond to those changes because it operates under different rules. So your effort does not produce expected results. Not because the effort is wrong, but because it is applied to the wrong system. This creates confusion. You feel, "I did everything correctly." And you did, within the visible layer. But the outcome was determined elsewhere. This is the failure of surface alignment. Now consider something deeper. Masking is not accidental. It is structural. Systems that benefit from control often operate below perception, because visibility introduces resistance. If you can see a system, you can question it. If you can question it, you can disrupt it. So dominant systems reduce visibility. They allow another system to occupy attention. A surface layer, simpler, easier to interpret, easier to engage with. And while you engage with that layer, the underlying system remains stable, unchallenged. This is the third distortion: engagement without awareness, where activity increases but understanding does not. You interact more, but see less, because attention is directed away from structure. Now here is where it becomes precise. Masking works because systems are layered, not separate. Layered. The visible system is not fake. It is real. It has rules. It produces effects. But it is incomplete. It is one layer of a multi-layer structure. And when you treat it as the full system, you lose accuracy. This is the fourth distortion: partial perception treated as total reality. Now consider the interaction. A system can mask another by controlling narrative, by shaping what is discussed, what is measured, what is evaluated. If the conversation remains within the visible layer, the hidden system remains protected, because it is never addressed, never mapped, never challenged. This creates stable control, not by suppression, but by redirection. You are free to act, free to think, free to engage, but within a bounded layer. And that boundary defines your impact. This is why many efforts fail silently, not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently, because they never reach the system that matters. Now shift perspective. Once you recognize masking, behavior changes. You stop reacting to the first layer you see. You begin to ask, what is this layer hiding? What system benefits from this visibility? What outcome is being shaped outside this frame? These questions break the surface. They force perception to expand. And once expanded, masking weakens. Not because the hidden system disappears, but because it becomes visible. And visibility changes interaction. Because once a system is seen, it can be mapped. Once mapped, it can be predicted. Once predicted, it can be navigated. This is the shift, from surface interaction to structural awareness, from reacting to appearance to identifying mechanism. Now control changes again. It is no longer responding correctly. It becomes seeing what is actually active. Because if you can see both layers, you are no longer constrained by the visible one. You can act with awareness of the hidden structure, and that creates advantage. Not through force, but through alignment. You are no longer optimizing for what is shown. You are positioning for what is real. And that difference separates reaction from control. System alignment, when systems reinforce each other. Conflict creates pressure. Masking creates distortion. But there is another state, far more powerful: alignment. A condition where multiple systems do not compete but reinforce each other. And when this happens, outcomes accelerate. Not gradually, not proportionally, exponentially. Because alignment does not add effects, it multiplies them. This is the first shift. When systems align, friction disappears. Signals move cleanly. Pathways reinforce. Loops stabilize. Everything begins to support the same direction. Now consider what this means. In conflict, each system pulls differently. Energy is divided. Effort is diluted. In alignment, all systems pull together. Energy concentrates. Effort compounds. The same action produces greater impact. not because the action changed, but because the structure around it is synchronized. This is where efficiency becomes power. Now look at the layers. A psychological system supports confidence. A social system rewards visibility. An informational system amplifies signal. A structural system provides leverage. Individually, each creates movement. Together, they create momentum. And momentum changes everything. Because once momentum forms, less input is required. The system begins to carry itself. This is the second shift, self-reinforcing dynamics, where output feeds input, where success amplifies probability of further success, not by chance, but by structure. This is why certain trajectories appear unstoppable, not because they are perfect, but because systems are aligned. Now here is where perception often fails. People see outcomes, but not alignment. They see rapid growth and attribute it to skill. They see influence and attribute it to charisma. They see control and attribute it to authority. But beneath all of that is alignment. Multiple systems working in the same direction. Without that, the same skill produces less. The same effort generates weaker results. This is the third shift. Output is not only a function of input, it is a function of alignment. Now consider something more precise. Alignment is rare, because systems are designed with different priorities, different timelines, different incentives. So natural alignment does not happen often. Most alignment is temporary, context-based, conditional. This is why momentum often collapses. Not because the system failed, but because alignment broke. One system shifts, another resists, a third disengages, and the structure loses coherence. Momentum slows, then stops. This is not random, it is structural. Now here is where advantage appears. If you can detect alignment, you can leverage it. Not by creating it, but by recognizing it early. Because alignment leaves signals. Clarity increases. Resistance decreases. Feedback becomes consistent. Reinforcement strengthens. These are indicators, not guarantees, but signals. And if you move while alignment is active, your impact multiplies. Because you are not pushing alone, you are moving with the system. This is the fourth shift. Timing becomes leverage. Not acting at any moment, but acting at the right moment, when systems are synchronized. Now consider the inverse. If you act against alignment, you face resistance, even if your action is correct, even if your reasoning is sound, because the structure is moving differently. This is why effort alone does not guarantee results, because effort must match alignment. Now go deeper. Alignment does not require perfection. It requires direction. Systems do not need to be identical. They need to be compatible, moving towards similar outcomes, reinforcing similar pathways. This creates coherence, not uniformity, but coordination. And coordination is enough. Now control changes again. It is no longer choosing the right action. It becomes recognizing when systems align. Because when alignment exists, small actions become significant. When alignment is absent, large actions become inefficient. This is where strategic awareness evolves. You stop forcing outcomes. You stop pushing against resistance. You begin to observe structure, wait for alignment, then act. Not passively, but precisely. And when you do, you experience something different. Not struggle, but flow. Not resistance, but acceleration. Not uncertainty, but direction. This is not luck. It is structural advantage. Now here is the final distinction. Alignment is not control. It is opportunity. Control begins when you understand how alignment forms, how it shifts, how it breaks. Because then, you are no longer dependent on it. You can anticipate it, position within it, and eventually, influence it. But that requires something deeper. Not just seeing systems, but interacting between them. Because alignment does not happen in isolation. It emerges from interaction. And interaction is where the next layer begins. System misalignment. When correct actions fail. Failure is often misunderstood. It is rarely caused by incorrect action. More often, it is caused by misalignment. You act correctly. Your reasoning is sound. Your execution is precise. And still, the outcome collapses. Not because the action failed, but because the structure around it did not support it. This is misalignment. A condition where systems are active but not synchronized, each one operating on its own logic, its own timing, its own direction. And when you act, you enter that structure. Not a neutral space, but a conflicting field, where correct action can produce incorrect results. This is the first shift. Success is not determined by accuracy alone. It is determined by structural compatibility. Now consider something simple. You make a decision based on long-term logic, strategic, measured, designed for future gain. But the environment rewards immediacy, speed, visibility, short-term output. Your decision is correct within one system, but misaligned with another. So the outcome appears as failure. Not because the logic is flawed, but because the system does not support it. This is the second shift. Correctness is relative, defined by system context, not universal truth. Now extend this further. Multiple systems operate simultaneously. A psychological system pushes caution. A social system pushes expression. An economic system pushes efficiency. An informational system pushes exposure. Each one demands a different response. And when you choose one, you violate another. This is unavoidable, because misalignment is not an exception. It is the default state. Alignment is rare. Conflict is constant. So every action carries trade-offs, visible or hidden, immediate or delayed. This creates tension, but more importantly, it creates illusion. You see the outcome, but not the systems behind it. So you misattribute failure. You think, I made the wrong move. But the move was correct in a different system. You think, I should have acted differently. But different action would have failed elsewhere. This is the third shift. Failure is often system-specific, not absolute. Now consider timing. Systems operate on different rhythms. One responds instantly, another responds slowly, a third responds only after accumulation. If your action aligns with one timeline, but not another, evaluation becomes distorted. You act. Nothing happens. You assume failure. But the system has not responded yet. Or worse, it already responded in a different layer. You just did not see it. This creates temporal misalignment, where outcome exists but is not recognized. And because of that, you adjust prematurely. You abandon correct strategy. You shift direction. And in doing so, you break alignment further. This is how misalignment compounds, not just through structure, but through reaction. Now go deeper. Misalignment is not always external. Sometimes it is internal. Your internal systems are not synchronized. Desire conflicts with logic. Emotion conflicts with strategy. Impulse conflicts with structure. You act in one direction, then correct in another. This creates internal fragmentation, not visible, but highly influential. Because even if external systems align, internal misalignment disrupts execution. You hesitate, you overcorrect, you lose precision. This is the fourth shift. Alignment must exist, internally and externally. Otherwise, execution destabilizes. Now here is where it becomes strategic. Most people respond to misalignment by increasing effort. They push harder, do more, act faster. They believe intensity will compensate for structure. It doesn't. It amplifies inefficiency, because effort without alignment creates resistance, not progress. This is why some people work intensely and move slowly, while others act minimally and accelerate. The difference is not effort, it is alignment. Now consider something critical. Misalignment is not always a problem. Sometimes it is information, a signal that systems are not ready, that conditions are not stable, that action should be delayed or redirected. This is the fifth shift. Misalignment is not failure, it is feedback, but only if you read it correctly. Because if you interpret it as failure, you react. If you interpret it as structure, you adjust. Now perception evolves. You stop asking, "Why didn't this work?" You begin asking, "Which systems were misaligned?" This separates cause from outcome. And once cause is visible, strategy improves. You begin to map systems, identify timing, recognize conflict, and most importantly, you stop forcing action into incompatible structures. You wait, or reposition, or shift systems entirely. Because sometimes the correct move is not to act better, but to act elsewhere. This is the final shift, from optimizing action to selecting environment. Because alignment is not always created. Sometimes it is found. And those who understand this do not waste effort in resistant systems. They move to where structure supports them. And once there, everything changes. Structural inevitability. Why outcomes can be read. Some outcomes feel predictable, not guessed, not estimated, seen before they happen. And when people witness this, they assume intuition, luck, experience. But that is not what is happening. What they are seeing is structure. Because systems do not behave randomly. They follow direction, not fixed direction, but constrained direction, bound by their configuration, their dependencies, their alignment. This creates inevitability, not certainty, but trajectory, a narrowing of possible outcomes, until only a few remain. This is the first shift. Prediction is not about the future. It is about the present, fully understood. Now consider what this means. In any moment, multiple systems are active, each one generating signals, each one moving in a direction. Individually, they create variation. But together, they create pattern. And when those patterns align, direction becomes visible. Not because you know what will happen, but because you know what cannot happen. This is the key. You do not predict outcomes, you eliminate impossibilities. And what remains is trajectory. Now take a situation. A system shows increasing alignment. Reinforcement is strengthening. Resistance is decreasing. Signals are consistent. Timing is synchronized. At the same time, competing systems weaken. Their signals fragment. Their pathways lose coherence. Their influence fades. This is not neutral. This is directional. The system is moving toward dominance. You do not need to guess the outcome. You can read the direction, because structure reveals movement. This is the second shift. Outcomes are not created at the end. They are built before they appear. What you call result is the final expression of a process already in motion. Now consider something deeper. People focus on events, moments, decisions. But events are surface level. They are outputs. What matters is structure, because structure determines which events can occur and which cannot. If a system lacks alignment, certain outcomes are impossible. If a system is saturated, certain transitions cannot stabilize. If dependencies are broken, certain structures cannot hold. So instead of asking, what will happen, you ask, what is structurally possible? And that question removes uncertainty. Now go further. Structural inevitability is not absolute. It can be disrupted, shifted, redirected, but only before stabilization completes. Once a system locks into coherence, change becomes difficult, because pathways reinforce themselves, loops stabilize, dependencies solidify. At that point, the trajectory is not just visible, it is self-sustaining. This is why some outcomes feel unstoppable, not because they are strong, but because they are aligned and already in motion. Now here is where it becomes precise. Most people observe outcomes after they happen. They explain them, rationalize them, attach meaning after the fact. But operators observe structure before outcomes form. They do not wait for events. They read alignment. They track signal consistency. They monitor reinforcement. And from that, they see direction. This is why it appears like prediction. It is not prediction. It is recognition of inevitability before it becomes visible. This is the third shift, seeing earlier, not seeing more. Now consider timing. There is a window between formation and manifestation, a period where structure exists, but outcome has not appeared. This is the most valuable moment, because influence is still possible. Adjustment is still effective. Once manifestation occurs, options decrease, because the system has stabilized. So the ability to read inevitability is not about knowing the future. It is about acting before the system closes. Now connect this to everything before. Multi-system interaction, conflict, alignment, dominance, masking. All of these shape structure, and structure shapes inevitability. So when multiple systems align, trajectory strengthens. When systems conflict, trajectory becomes unstable. When dominance shifts, trajectory redirects. This is not abstract, it is observable, but only if you look at the right layer. Not events, not actions, not isolated signals, but structure. Now this leads to the most important realization. You are not inside randomness. You are inside constrained systems. And within those systems, outcomes are limited, shaped, directed. And if you can see those constraints, you can see direction. And if you can see direction, you can move before others. Not faster, not harder, earlier. This is where advantage exists, not in reacting to events, but in positioning within trajectory. Because once the system moves, it carries everything with it. And those inside follow, whether they understand it or not. This is the moment where perception changes permanently. You stop asking, what will happen? You start asking, what is already happening that has not yet appeared? And once you see that, you are no longer predicting reality. You are reading it. Positioning between systems, where real leverage exists. Most people try to operate inside systems. They learn the rules, adapt to incentives, optimize behavior. They become efficient within a structure. But efficiency is not leverage, because inside a system, you are constrained by it. Your options are defined. Your movement is limited. Your outcomes are shaped by the system itself. So even at your best, you are still operating within boundaries. This is the first limitation. You can improve your position, but not redefine the structure. Real leverage does not exist inside systems. It exists between them, in the space where systems intersect, where their rules conflict, where their priorities diverge, where their logic breaks. This is where control appears, not by following rules, but by navigating gaps. Now consider what this means. When two systems interact, they do not align perfectly. There are mismatches, contradictions, delays, blind spots. And within those imperfections, there is space. Space where neither system fully controls the outcome. That space is leverage. Because in that space, you are not fully constrained. You can move without being immediately corrected. You can act without being fully predicted. You can position without being fully defined. This is the second shift. Freedom is not outside systems. It exists in their overlap. Now observe behavior. Most people commit to one system. They identify with it, align with it, operate through it. They become predictable, because once you are fully inside, your actions follow structure. Your responses can be mapped, your outcomes anticipated. This is why high performers within a single system are still limited. They are optimized, but contained. Now compare that to someone operating between systems. They do not commit fully to one structure. They shift, they observe, they move across boundaries. They understand how one system interprets another, and how that interpretation can be used. This creates asymmetry, because systems are not designed to account for external logic. They process inputs based on internal rules. So when you introduce movement from another system, it creates distortion, misinterpretation, delay. And within that delay, there is advantage. This is the third shift. Leverage comes from mismatch, not alignment. Now consider timing. When systems conflict, there is a moment where neither dominates fully, a transition point, an unstable phase. Most people avoid this because it feels uncertain, undefined, uncomfortable. But this is where leverage is highest, because structure is not yet fixed, outcomes are not yet locked, and influence is still possible. This is where positioning matters, not before, not after, but during transition. Now connect this to structural inevitability. If you can read trajectory, you know which system will dominate. But if you move too early, you are constrained by the current system. If you move too late, you are constrained by the new one. The optimal position is between them, where transition is active, where structure is fluid, where both systems are present, but neither fully controls. This is the fourth shift. Timing defines leverage, not just where you act, but when. Now consider something deeper. Operating between systems requires detachment. You cannot fully identify with one structure, because identification anchors you, limits you, defines your perspective. To move between systems, you must see them as structures, not identities, not truths. Structures, with rules, with boundaries, with limitations. And once you see that, you stop being inside them. You begin to navigate them. This is where perception changes again. You are no longer asking, how do I succeed in this system? You are asking, how does this system interact with others? And that question reveals leverage points, places where rules conflict, where signals distort, where control weakens. Now here is the critical distinction. Leverage is not about breaking systems. It is about using their interaction. You do not destroy structure. You position within it. You allow systems to create openings, and you move through them. This is why it appears subtle, invisible, because nothing is forced. Everything is aligned with existing structure, but used in a different way. Now consider the consequence. Once you operate between systems, you are harder to predict, harder to control. Because no single system defines your behavior. You are not fixed, not static, not contained. You are moving through structure, not within it. And that changes everything. Because systems rely on predictability, on stability, on defined patterns. Remove that, and control weakens. Now this is the threshold. Most people never reach this level, because it requires not just understanding systems, but separating from them. seeing structure without being defined by it. And once you cross that threshold, you no longer follow systems. You navigate them. And where systems intersect, you position. Because that is where leverage lives. Shifting dominance. How systems get reframed. Dominance does not stay fixed. It shifts. Not randomly, but through subtle changes in how situations are interpreted. This is where most people misunderstand control. They try to force outcomes, push harder, act more. But force operates inside a system, and inside a system, you are still constrained by its rules. Real control happens elsewhere, at the level where systems are defined. Because the system that defines interpretation defines outcome. So if you can shift which system interprets a situation, you shift the result, without changing the event itself. This is the first shift. Control is not changing reality. It is changing which structure reads reality. Now consider what this means. A single situation can be interpreted through multiple systems. A decision can be seen as risk or opportunity. A delay can be seen as failure or preparation. An action can be seen as aggressive or decisive. The underlying event does not change, but the system that interprets it does. And that interpretation determines response. Now go deeper. Each system carries its own logic, its own evaluation criteria, its own direction. So when you shift interpretation, you shift logic, you shift criteria, you shift direction. And once direction changes, outcome follows. This is how dominance is moved, not by overpowering, but by reframing. Now observe how this works structurally. Systems do not process raw events. They process signals through predefined pathways. Meaning is assigned based on internal rules. So if a signal enters a system, it is interpreted according to that system's logic. But signals are not fixed. They can be positioned, presented, framed in ways that align with different systems. And when that happens, the same signal activates different pathways. This is the second shift. Signals are flexible. Interpretation is conditional. Now consider the implication. If you understand multiple systems, you can direct signals toward the one you want to dominate. You do not change the signal itself. You change how it is received. And once received differently, it produces a different outcome. This is where it becomes precise. Shifting dominance requires awareness of which systems are active, which system is currently dominant, which system could override it, because not all systems can dominate equally. Some are stronger in certain conditions. Some require alignment. Some require timing. So the shift is not arbitrary. It is strategic. You identify which system benefits you most, which system can realistically take control, which conditions allow the shift. Then you position signals accordingly. Now consider a moment of conflict. One system defines a situation negatively, restrictive, limiting, closing options. But another system could interpret the same situation as expansion, opportunity, reconfiguration. If the first system remains dominant, outcome contracts. If the second takes over, outcome expands. So the question is not, what is happening? The question is, which system will define what is happening? And that is where control exists. Now here is the critical part. Most people do not see systems. They see narratives, stories, explanations. And narratives are the surface layer of system interpretation. So when you shift narrative, you shift perception. When perception shifts, system dominance shifts. This is why small changes in framing can produce large changes in outcome. Not because reality changed, but because interpretation did. Now this is where it becomes advanced. Shifting dominance is not always direct. You do not always replace one system with another. Sometimes you introduce a competing system. Let it interact. Let it create friction. Let it destabilize the current dominance. And within that instability, a new system emerges as dominant. This is indirect control, not forcing change, but creating conditions for change to occur. Now consider timing again. Dominance is easiest to shift during instability, when systems are in conflict, when alignment is weak, when interpretation is unclear. At those moments, structure is flexible, meaning is not fixed, and influence has greater impact. Once a system stabilizes, dominance becomes harder to move, because pathways reinforce, loops strengthen, interpretation becomes consistent. So shifting dominance is not just about how, but when. Now here is the final shift. Control is not about mastering one system. It is about moving between them, understanding how they interpret, how they interact, how they override each other. And once you understand that, you are no longer bound by a single frame. You can shift frames. And when you shift frames, you shift outcomes. Not by force, not by resistance, but by structure. And that is where real control begins. Beyond systems, where power actually begins. You are not inside one system. You are inside many. Overlapping, conflicting, reinforcing, masking, and until now, you have been moving through them, sometimes aligned, sometimes misaligned, sometimes aware, mostly not. But there is a deeper realization. Systems do not just shape outcomes, they shape perception. They define what is visible, what is meaningful, what is possible. And because of that, most people never leave them. They adapt, optimize, react. They become better inside structure, but they remain inside it. This is the limit. Understanding systems is not power. Navigating systems is not power. Even positioning between systems is not the highest level, because all of that still assumes that systems define reality. But they don't. They define interpretation of reality. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you see systems as interpretive layers, not absolute structures, you are no longer bound to any single one. You can move between them, you can read them, you can shift them, but more importantly, you can step outside their default framing. This is the first break. Not escaping systems, but detaching from their authority. Now consider what this means. A system presents a situation, defines it, frames it, assigns meaning. And within that frame, certain actions are logical, certain outcomes are expected. But that frame is not the only one. It is one of many. And once you see multiple frames, you are no longer constrained by the first one you encounter. This is where perception expands, not by adding more information, but by recognizing that interpretation itself is variable. And once interpretation is variable, control increases. Because now, you are not reacting to a fixed reality. You are interacting with multiple representations of it. Now go deeper. Most people live inside dominant systems. They do not question them, because dominant systems feel natural, obvious, unavoidable. But dominance is not truth. It is alignment, temporary, contextual. And once that alignment shifts, dominance shifts, which means what feels real can change. This is the second break. Reality is not fixed at the level of interpretation. It is structured, and structures can shift. Now this leads to a critical transition. Everything you have seen so far, multi-system interaction, conflict, alignment, dominance, masking, inevitability, positioning, these are not isolated concepts. They are layers of the same structure, a system of systems, interacting, shaping, evolving. And once you see that, you stop focusing on individual systems. You start focusing on the relationships between them, because that is where movement happens. Not inside fixed rules, but in interaction. Now here is the final shift of this chapter. Power is not located inside any system. It is not in control of a structure. It is not in dominance within a frame. Power exists in your ability to navigate across frames without being captured by one, to recognize structure without being defined by it, to shift interpretation without losing direction. That is the threshold, where systems stop being constraints and become tools, where structure stops limiting and starts enabling, where perception stops reacting and starts directing. This is where most people stop, because this level is uncomfortable. It removes certainty, removes fixed identity, removes stable ground. But it introduces something else, clarity. Because once you are no longer bound by a single system, you begin to see patterns across all of them. You see repetition, structure, cycles. You see how systems form, how they stabilize, how they collapse, how they re-emerge. And once you see that, you are no longer surprised by change. You expect it, you read it, you move with it. Now this is the transition point. Everything so far has been about systems, understanding them, reading them, navigating them. But the next layer goes further, because systems do not exist in isolation. They exist within larger structures, interconnected, nested, stacked. And those structures define environments, not just outcomes, but entire fields of reality. So the next step is not understanding systems. It is understanding how entire environments are shaped, how multiple systems combine to create controlled realities, and how those realities can be influenced. This is where the episode shifts, from systems to environments, from interaction to architecture of reality itself. And once you enter that layer, you are no longer asking, how do systems work? You are asking, how is reality constructed? You thought you were inside one system. Then you saw many. Then you learned to move between them. But systems are not the final layer. They are components of something larger. The next chapter moves beyond interaction into construction, where systems combine to shape entire environments, and where control is no longer about navigating structure, but designing it.